Welcome, everyone, to our roundtable on the intersection of data science and human values. I'm Sam Fletcher. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy. I'm going to be the Master of Ceremonies for this particular roundtable. The agenda is that we're going to have three short discussions, one by me giving a kind of high-level overview of what that means, what the intersection of data science and human values means, without really going into particular detail about particular cases. For that, drawing from their own research, we have two additional panelists, Carolyn Liebler, professor of sociology here at the U, and Russell Funk, professor of strategic management and entrepreneurship at the Carlson School. So each of us is going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to give our presentations. First, the overview from me, then Carolyn and Russell will give short discussions about how they understand this sort of intersection from the perspective of their research. And that should leave us for about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Good. So without further ado, I will get started. Let me get my set up. Okay, here we go. Let's see here. How does this look to everyone? Does it look okay? All right, excellent. Thank you for the feedback. So when it comes to the intersection of data science and human values, we can first ask the question, what do we mean by data science and what do we mean by human values? There's a pretty broad range of answers that we could give to this. And for the purposes of our roundtable, we're going to be understanding this quite generally. I'm going to understand data science as a kind of what philosophers like to call a cluster concept. What that means here is that instead of giving like necessary and sufficient conditions for what some sort of investigation for it to be data science, it lists a bunch of criteria that tend to be the types of things that one finds in data science. And the more of them that one finds in a particular activity, the more that we might be inclined to classify something as being a part of data science. So none of them is necessary and none of them is sufficient, but to the extent that they use these sorts of ideas, they can be more closely tied to being a part of data science. And one of them has to do with what sorts of disciplines are involved. Data science tends to be an interdisciplinary activity that involves combinations of ideas from statistics, computer science, and some particular domain of application. That domain can be sociology, it can be business, it can be economics, it can be genomics, where folks are interested in taking, well, now we go to the goals, right? One common goal, right, is that they're taking data and they're interested in using data to predict future phenomena. Another sort of goal that people have in the context of data science is to use these tools to create decision-making tools or to facilitate complex decision-making. But sometimes the activity is just directed towards describing phenomena. Sometimes this goes under the sub-label of data mining, taking a large data set and finding patterns in it that are of interest. Now, how do they do this? Well, they do this using data, and that doesn't seem to be particularly unique, but the way that they use data tends to involve tools from both statistics, computer science, and the domains of application that the data are from. The data, sometimes, not always, but it tends to be big. So big data here means high in volume, lots of data. It can mean high in variety, lots of different types or heterogeneous types of data, or it can mean high in velocity. The input or the accumulation of the data is very rapid with respect to other sorts of activities. Now, this data can be structured or it can be unstructured. What that means is that the data can have a very well-defined form that it fits into. This is the type of data that's usually collected, for instance, in observational and experimental studies in science, but it can also be quite unstructured. it can involve a wide range of different sorts of pieces of information that may be different from context to context. Some types of unstructured data, for instance, include information about web browsing behavior, or information that people fill out on surveys where many different sorts of questions are open-ended and are not required. The data involved can be quantitative or it can be qualitative. So what I mean by this is that the data can involve kind of traditional categories of data, but it can also include things like images or videos or text or audio speech or music. Now, when these data sets, right, are used in the context of the goals that I just mentioned, the prediction might be a prediction of some quantitative phenomena, but prediction might also involve a prediction of some sort of qualitative phenomena. Instead of predicting, for example, the number of items that might appear in a particular category of investigation, such as an attempt to predict the number of customers, say, that will come into a store during a period. It might involve making a prediction that involves creating a new image or a new text. And the way that they do this involves characteristic methods. So some of these methods are described as machine learning methods or artificial intelligence methods. But some of them use more traditional statistical methods regarding regression and classification. Overall, data science tends to be more data-driven than hypothesis-driven. That is to say that instead of starting with a particular hypothesis that one is interested in testing and then collecting data to test that hypothesis, it's more common to collect a large amount of data that one has some sense that it would be of interest, or gather data that was collected for other reasons, and then use these sorts of tools to facilitate in prediction for some thing of interest, describe or discover new phenomena, or assist people in creating decision-making tools. I want to emphasize again that none of these is a necessary criterion for some investigation to count as data science, and none of them is sufficient. But the extent to which many of these are used would be the extent to which we might classify something as data science. So when it comes to human values, I'd like to list 4 types that I'm going to be talking about more. It's a broad subject, of course, but some of the types of human values that are often implicated in data science research involve things like privacy. So we value privacy with respect to, for instance, personal characteristics. This could be medical information. It could be information about voting patterns, about which library books you check out, right? And about your choices, right? So that could include things like web browsing history. So the sense in which privacy can be implicated in these involves the fact that many of the sets of data that are collected in the context of data science investigations involve information that either describes directly or indirectly personal characteristics and choices that people in some contexts would want to have private. It also implicates questions of justness, especially when data science projects are involved in facilitating decision-making. We can ask the question about whether those decisions were made fairly or in a non-discriminatory manner, both with respect to an overall moral view and with respect to the legal question of discrimination. A third sort of human value that's often implicated in this sort of research has to do with human dignity. So a big question that involving any sort of research that uses large amounts of data representing people or their choices or their attributes has to do with whether or not we should be describing phenomena in terms that erase the complex features of the humans that they describe. Sometimes people describe this as non-objectification, not treating people as objects. And navigating that issue in data science research can be one of the challenges. Another aspect related to this has to do with what some people call, and there's been some recent legislation in the European Union about this, rights to explanations for decisions that are made for us, and see this as a part of human dignity. In this context, you might have a situation where a data science project produces a decision-making tool that is used by some agency or group, for instance, in deciding whether or not to grant parole to someone in the criminal justice system, or to approve an application for a mortgage loan. The decision might be denied, and the person implicated in that decision might ask for an explanation for why their application was denied. In some contexts, we might think that they're owed an explanation. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that the tools that I was describing, from machine learning and artificial intelligence, some of them at least, don't easily facilitate explanations for how the decision-making procedure is made. So that is another example of a human value that's implicated in certain types of data science research. Another type of value is efficiency, reduced waste, and improved well-being. Many people use data science tools to try to develop new ways to organize society or new ways to undergo activities that we're interested in to improve efficiency. So when we talk about the intersection of these two sorts of things, we can make a distinction between two not mutually exclusive, but distinct ways that data science and human values can intersect. I've given you a few examples so far, but we might distinguish between an intersection that involves the goals or ends of a project and an intersection that involves the methodology of a project. Let me give you a few examples of intersections involving the goals or ends of a project. I'm taking these examples from the Data Science for the Public Good project, which is a collaboration between a few different public universities in Virginia, as well as Iowa State and Oregon State. So here is a wall of text that gives you a bunch of titles of different projects in that particular collaboration between those universities. I just want to highlight a few of them for you to describe how these different sorts of activities of data science are used. Let's look at this first one here. Access barriers to health in rural Virginia. Here, the goal involves a fairness value, right? And more widely speaking, questions of justice with regards to healthcare access. The type of purpose for the project, right, to address that is going to involve a descriptive project, right? This particular one involves looking at large sets of data and trying to find patterns that might correlate with barriers to health access. Let's look at this one here, expand the Iowa State University Extension Community Helpline. This one involves a data science project that's also about equity, but also about efficiency. The issue with the community helpline is that it's a bit overwhelmed, and they're looking for ways to increase the efficiency of their work to better serve more people. They are attempting to use methods from data science to automate certain types of paperwork that people working at the helpline have to fill out. By reducing the amount of paperwork that they fill out and giving them decision tools for automatically filling out that paperwork, it allows the folks working on the helpline to devote more of their time to helping people who call. This one here, identify communities in greatest need of excessive alcohol prevention efforts. This one has, again, a targeted goal regarding equity and involves, again, in this particular case, a descriptive activity. This one a little bit more focused. In particular, it involves a predictive activity as well as a descriptive one, trying to understand the context in which different communities will have needs for alcohol prevention, excessive alcohol use prevention efforts. And we find a similar one here in this last one, forecasting tools for cost analysis of water and wastewater facilities. This one is a predictive tool that's aimed towards efficiency. Here, the data science project is aimed at predicting these costs so that users can better anticipate what they can be and run a more efficient facilities for small towns. Okay, so in all of these projects, some aspects of efficiency or justice are the targets of the data science project. But of course, data science projects can also involve these human values in their methodology. I'm just going to give you a few examples here. So one has to do with privacy. So even if a data science project is involved in a target that doesn't necessarily, a goal that doesn't necessarily address privacy, the data that it uses may have privacy implications. This is going to be the case for any sort of financial and identifying information, for medical records, and for web browsing history. And there's a tension between privacy and, for instance, the desire to have data sets be open and accessible to other researchers. That presents a challenge. Another is justice. So even though one aspiration of using data science tools for automated decision-making is that it removes human biases from the decision-making process, of course, when those tools are trained on decisions that are made by humans or with biased input data, that can have implications for the bias that the decision-making tools can have. And this can be measured in terms of, for example, disparate impacts on protected groups. And it can also involve different criteria for fairness of what it would mean to have a fair decision procedure for these different groups. When it comes to questions about human dignity, in the process of doing a data science project, it raises the question about whether certain sorts of important decisions ought to be automated, right, to preserve human dignity, and whether or not we are owed explanations for decisions. And in questions of efficiency, it raises the question of whether or not to have efficient data sharing procedures, right, there's a conflict with privacy. Efficiency, of course, can improve quality of life, though. Now, with all of these different features, maybe I wanted to give two sorts of highlights, two takeaway points at this very high level. One is that the way that data science intersects with human values can involve conflicts between different sorts of values, and adjudicating those conflicts can involve and may require deep discussions about how to compromise between these different values. And moreover, values can enter at any stage of a project. They can enter in the beginning or in the end, but they can also enter in during the methodology, right? What might seem like technical aspects of undergoing the data science project may in fact involve implicit decisions about what sorts of things are more valuable and which sorts of things are less valuable. And so each of these aspects requires attention at every stage of a data science project. Okay, so that's a kind of like the 20,000-foot overview, which philosophers love to do instead of actually getting into concrete details. But for that, we've got Carolyn Liebler and Russell Funk, who are going to talk about some of these aspects in their own research. Carolyn, can I invite you to share your screen and begin your presentation?
Great. I'll make sure I can see everything at once.
Great. And while you're setting up, I'll just give a reminder to everyone that we'll have Carolyn and Russell give their presentations, and then after that, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end.
Getting there. These two screens, but I still want to see you all if I can. Okay, you can see this? Good. Okay, so thank you so much for that that overview of how a philosopher sees this. I just find that fascinating. I remember taking philosophy classes when I was a math major and loved the inherent logic, but also thinking in the bigger picture. So my name is Carolyn Liebler. I'm a sociologist and demographer, and I specialize in American Indian people and census data, among other things. So I guess I just will take this chance to first give a little bit of an introduction to, let's see, there you go. introduction to American Indian census data so that you know what I'm talking about. And then talk through a few of the, these are actually listed as Belmont ethics principles, because when I teach my methods class, that's how I organize it. And so those are high on my mind. And these, I guess, fit within sort of the idea that the ethical decisions come in throughout the process, that you're thinking throughout the data science project about how to be fair and just and inclusive to the people that you're trying to study. So federal data treat this AIAN, that's American Indian and Alaska Native, excuse me, that's a federally defined race group, but it's not really a race. Anyway, it's a socially constructed category. I just want to just make that clear, that I understand that and that you should be thinking about it that way. And what that means by socially constructed is that social factors define who counts as American Indian and who gets to say, because different people will say different versions of who counts. So that's all very political and socially defined and has a lot of variation. A couple of things that you may not know, that when people mark American Indian or Alaska Native race on the census, this can be intended to foreground tribal sovereignty, because they're asked in that question, what's your tribe? And even though, so it may not be a complete capture of all of their possible identities. It could be just that they want to share that this is their tribe, this is important to them, and they know that the census is how funding gets distributed. So it's important to them to make sure that they're counted in that way. And also along the same lines, marking a single race on the census can be an identity statement as opposed to a family tree statement. So for me, when I mark single race white, that's an identity statement and a family tree statement. But it can, those are, for some people, you have an identity that's one way and then a family tree. So lots of people who are American Indian have 3 out of 4 grandparents are not American Indian, but they are in terms of how they think, how they live, how they see themselves, and how they want to be counted on the census. So that's part of the social construction of the category, is that people get to choose how they represent themselves. So here's the total number of American Indians counted in the censuses. 1890 was the first time the Census Bureau tried to count all the American Indians. And you can see that we've had a real transition from about 1960. This is when, of course, we had the American Indian movement, but we also switched to being able to self-report in a census instead of having the enumerators go around and look at you and decide who you are, or what you are. So it's a growing population. Okay, so let's turn to some ethical considerations. One thing is, in terms of consent and just control of, I guess it's related to privacy, but a lot of times in American Indian community, this is called data sovereignty. So who has the rights to data about an American Indian person? And if the data collection is conducted on tribal land, which is sovereign place, does the tribe have rights to the data? Does the tribe have more rights to the data than the Census Bureau has to the data? Or does the individual get to choose? I think for me, these are, I don't know, it's kind of a philosophical question. because right now the tribe has no rights to the data, and the Census Bureau has all the rights, and the Census Bureau tries to keep it private from an individualistic perspective, but doesn't give extra access to tribes about the people on their land. They do have some programs, but that's not the same thing as data sovereignty. The tribes have no real control. Another topic in the Belmont ethics principles is beneficence. And in this is first do no harm, and then that the benefits must outweigh the risks. And this is an issue that is, there we go. So for me, one of the things that that I really work towards when I'm reporting my results is to make sure that people who went to the risk of answering the census are included in the data analysis, because if we're leaving them out of data analysis, they can't receive the benefits, and therefore any risk there is of participating in the census, the benefits have to outweigh the risks, and if there's no benefits, then the risks are always going to win. So one of the issues is that there's a lot of 2 or more races people in the American Indian population. So the gray bar and the red bar in this chart are the 2 or more races populations. You can see that there's it's growing over time. There's a lot of people. So this is more than half of the American Indian population at this point. It's also more than half of the Pacific Islander population, but multiple race is a small proportion of other groups. And so often the Census Bureau or other analysts who are working with these data, that what they do is they take all the multiple race people and they put them into a category called 2 or more races, so they're taking, a Black American Indian, they're taking a white Asian, they're taking a person who's Hawaiian and Thai and white, and they're just taking all these people from this wide variety of groups, putting them into this category called 2 or more races, and then it's not an analyzable category. And so for some people, they feel like they're making their analysis really clean, but to me, I feel like that's a beneficence problem. What we're doing is we're taking out half of the American Indian population and we're making that data unusable. And so here's just an example of, right now is Native American Heritage Month, and the Census Bureau put out this little graphic, and they put out this graphic of education only for American Indian and Alaska Native population alone. So that means only single race American Indians. And that's, this is like their main graphic for American Indian Heritage Month. So that's it. That's a little bit about beneficence. Another beneficence issue is when right now the 2020 census is having a serious problem from my perspective. The Census Bureau has decided that their old way of releasing data to the public doesn't give enough data privacy. And so what they've decided to do is add or subtract a random number of people from each category. So if you add or subtract and they do this at every geographic level, except that's below the state. So if you add or subtract 100 people from a population of 200 people, what you get is a mess. Like, that's unanalyzable data. And they haven't they've only submitted, shown us demonstration products at this point, but the data demonstration products for American Indians are very seriously concerning for tribal land. And so that what that means is not only do the tribes not get like a personal copy of the data for their collected on their lands, but also the data that they do get is unusable, because for the thing is that they're not going to tell us, did they add 100? Did they subtract 100? Did they add 20? You know, what did they do? That's the point, is they're trying not to let us know. And so the data that essentially they're destroying the data, that's the concern. And based on what I've seen of, for example, based on what I've seen, it looks like the data are pretty much useless. In which case, why should anyone have gone to the risk of participating in the census? I mean, 2020 census, you were risking COVID besides privacy risk. And then finally, justice. There is very unequal access to the most useful data. So thinking about the difference between the access that I have as a tenured professor at a research university with, I have security clearance at the Census Bureau, and I have the resources of the university, and I have access to a lot more useful data about American Indians using the restricted use data, going to the Census Bureau, working with colleagues there. I never run into anyone who's representing a tribe or is American Indian who's in these spaces having this kind of access. And so I just wanted to raise the idea that there seems like there should be some kind of effort. It's got to be somebody's responsibility to make it more accessible. And I suppose I just want to leave it as an open question of whose responsibility is it, and you know, how I would love to be part of the answer to that. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I think I can. There we go.
Great. Thanks so much, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Just as a reminder for folks, we'll have discussion at the very end. So next we'll have Russell Funk give his presentation. Russ, are you able to share your screen?
Yes. One second. Can you see that?
Yep, I can see it.
Oops. All right, let me try that. Okay, so first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this session. This is a topic that I think is tremendously important, and one that I've spent a good bit of time thinking about. I use a lot of data science techniques in my research, and then my teaching in the business school has primarily been in the area of business ethics and business and society. And so this is, you know, really nicely at the intersection of two of my worlds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own research that's been trying to use techniques from network science, which you can think of as a subset of data science, and using them to study big data, or using big data in the application of those methods to try to study health equity. And so I think the way that you can think about a lot of what I'll be discussing is in kind of to use some of Sam's distinction, the goals of the research. You know, human values fits in that this is a goal of these projects to pursue equity, specifically in the area of health. But in the end, I also will take a little bit of time to talk a bit about the methods and the method component and where values fit in there. So a little on the motivation. One of the things that I think is really exciting about data science is that we can use it to tackle big societal level problems that have been around for a really, really long time. But new data, new methodologies give us a new lens on those problems. And sometimes, just descriptively, again, to use Sam's, you made a lot of really good distinctions, descriptively kind of better understand a problem. And if we have better knowledge about it, we can better address it, but also to give us very different ways of looking at a problem. And so sometimes you have a big societal challenge like health equity, and the ways you've tried to address it are very challenging. There's not obvious routes. And so maybe if you have better data and different tools, you can see alternative ways of addressing those problems that that weren't available to you before. So we all probably know that the U.S. healthcare system it faces tremendous challenges and has for a long time. We spend more on healthcare than comparable countries, about 18% of GDP in 2016. But there's relatively little to show for that spending. And on a lot of key indicators like longevity, infant mortality, and so forth, the US ranks near the bottom of industrialized countries. What's more than that, though, is that the poor outcomes delivered by the healthcare system are not spread out evenly among the population. And we know that they tend to be disproportionately experienced by minorities. So for example, Black patients undergoing heart surgery are more likely to die than white patients of comparable health. Black patients with heart failure tend to have worse prognoses for patients with higher mortality. And you'll see why I'm talking about heart failure, because that's sort of in cardiac surgery, because that's the context of this research. So there's lots and lots of different causes for these disparities, some of which are known, some of which are yet to be explored, surely. But new research coming out over the past couple of years has started to suggest that the social structure of care delivery, and I'm, by the way, Carolyn, sociologist by training, PhD, so you're getting a very sociological lens on the applications today. So the social structure of care delivery, by which I mean the way that physicians and other providers work together, plays an important role in contributing to these disparities. So we know that collaborative healthcare is an increasingly collaborative process. It depends on close coordination among different specialists who often work across different boundaries. And so care delivery networks are important then for things like information sharing, consistent treatment plans, matching patients with appropriate providers, and so forth. But emerging evidence, some coming from our work, suggests that the networks of providers, these care delivery networks serving minorities, are structured in ways that tend to be more isolated from the other broader networks of physicians, which could result in lower access to specialty care, higher spending, and lower quality care. And so what we've been doing over the past few years is using data science, network science techniques to study these care delivery networks and their relationship with disparities. So our goal, kind of to get down to the details a little more, is that we want to map out care delivery networks, which you can think of as sort of, they come into being as patients flow from physician to physician. So I'm a primary care physician. I make a referral to a surgeon. The surgeon then refers that patient back to me, and then the patient goes to see a medical specialist. The medical specialist refers that patient to another physician. And so if you repeat that process for a lot of different patients, you start to get these networks. And we know that that those networks are very highly correlated. They tend to map on well with provider communication patterns. And so we want to map those networks. Typically, and the way that this was done for many years was via surveys, where you'd ask providers about their professional ties, which is a good way to get nice, detailed, granular data, but that doesn't scale well. And so our understanding was really limited to things like single health systems, a couple hundred or at most 1,000 providers. What's neat about this big data revolution is that we have all this administrative data that records the movement of patients, their conditions, and so forth through the healthcare system, like electronic medical records and insurance claims. And we can use that to map at a very large scale the detailed information about flows of patients and care delivery networks. And so of that data, what our group has primarily been using are administrative claims, in particular, data from Medicare. And so these data are really nice because they're very complete. Essentially, everybody in the country over age 65 gets their health insurance via Medicare in one way or another. And so if we look at conditions that predominantly affect the elderly, it can get us a really, really rich and complete snapshot of care delivery patterns. We've looked at a number of different procedures: colectomy, prostatectomy, hip replacement, and then heart bypass surgery, coronary artery bypass grafting, or CABG, which is what I'll talk about today. And to give you just a sense for the scale, again, going back to some of Sam's points, we can look at the networks across about 4,000 hospitals spanning 4 years. In the data, the maps I'll show you, there's something like 14, almost 15 million physician-patient encounters, almost 700,000 physicians. So this is very large scale data. And so let me just dig into the way that we go from these administrative claims, which were not designed for research purposes, which is one of the, I'd say, key characteristics of a lot of data science data sets. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So how do we go from this administrative data to maps of care delivery networks? And so imagine we have a patient, and this is my screen's messing up, so this is supposed to be nice and animated, but you can hopefully get the idea. And the patient goes to see the primary care physician. Say that the patient wakes up and they've got some chest pain. Primary care physician says, maybe does some tests and says, oh, well, you should go see a surgeon. Maybe this is something that we need to operate on. The patient then goes to see the surgeon. Then the surgeon says, yes, you need surgery. So the patient goes to the hospital where he sees a surgeon. Maybe he's got some kidney problems. He's a psychiatrist, a couple other specialists. Gets discharged, goes to follow up with a PCP, goes for follow-up with a surgeon, sees the PCP again a couple months later, and so forth. Now, each time there's an encounter between the patient and the physician, we get an insurance claim. Right? And so there are all these little, I like to say, digital breadcrumbs that get left in these computer systems that track, for billing purposes, the patient encounters. And then we can use those to start mapping these networks. So we know that the patient saw the PCP 3 times, so we've got 3 encounters, surgeon 3 times, and so forth. What we want to do is we're not interested in the claims, so we get rid of those. And then we can start to draw connections between the PCP, the endocrinologist, the psychiatrist, all around this shared patient. And we know that since they were caring for a patient around a discrete episode of care, which is a major episode of care, heart surgery, that they probably had some kind of communication, right? And especially if they're working together on multiple different patients, we can sort of infer that there's likely some sort of relationship. And so then we repeat this process for all the patients within a health system over the course, some period of time, say a year, and we start to get these health system level maps, right? And what we want to do then is try to characterize these networks and see what their properties are, and whether, kind of based on what we know from sociological theories and network theories, they're configured in ways that you might think would make delivering high quality care better. So rich information flows, tight team coordination, and so forth. And then whether those patterns differ at all by the local population served, by the demographics. And so we're going to look at 3 measures for these networks, what we call repeat ties. So this is just, do the same physicians work together over and over again? Clustering is sort of, are your friends with one another, right? So do the physicians that I work with tend to work with each other kind of independently of me? And then external ties is, do the physicians work with anyone outside their immediate region or community? So like, do I have information exchange or share patients with people in the neighborhood over and so forth, or am I kind of very concentrated in my one geographic zone? And the reason we're interested in that is that we know, segregation is particularly prominent in healthcare delivery, and is identified as a potential problem. Okay, and so this is kind of the exciting thing that I think you can do with these methods, is that you can start to get these really neat visualizations. And so what we have here, each one of these networks represents a collaborative set of physicians for a particular health system in a particular city in a particular state. So these are snapshots of collaborative care around patients undergoing bypass surgery. And you can start to see that there are some differences in the networks in the top row versus the bottom row. So the top row are networks in regions where there's a high proportion of Black residents. The bottom row is regions where there's a low proportion. These are predominantly white neighborhoods or regions. And so I realize that it's unfortunately a little bit hard to see, but you can see that the nodes, so each point represents a physician. A connection means that they work together. And so the bottom row, there's just far more of the green dots, which mean these are the external ties. So these are physicians that are part of the network, but come from adjacent neighborhoods and potentially even cities. Whereas the top row, there's far more, it's all red. These are all local physicians, right? We also notice, and it's a little hard to see, but you can tell it a little bit more in the numbers, that there are far more repeated ties in the health systems serving predominantly white residents than in the top row, which we know that these repeated ties, there's a lot of literature on team familiarity in healthcare and how working together with the same people is really an important predictor of outcomes, suggesting that the networks in the bottom row might be less equipped to provide high quality care. The other final property is this clustering coefficient, which typically we would think of as being good because it again it's kind of like the repeated ties, except more of a structural version in that you would expect networks with higher clustering to be better for coordination and so forth because you've got these shared contacts. But when you take it with the other properties, it kind of suggests something that might be a little undesirable. So there's generally higher clustering in the health system serving greater proportions of Black residents. When you take it with the lack of external ties and the lower proportion of repeat ties, it kind of paints this picture that these health systems, the networks within these health systems are more isolated, right? And which again suggests less information flow, less ability to have exposure to best practices and so forth. These are just the regression results when we apply this to the whole sample. So these conclusions are not just based on these three pictures, but we can study this across, as I said, thousands of health systems. And the patterns I showed you are just are supported there. So what I want to do, this was a short talk. I don't think I need to recap everything I said, but so I want to instead step back a little bit and talk a little bit about data science and human value. So as I previewed at the beginning, I think there's a lot of opportunities to use data science for good. Until recently, this large scale structure of care delivery networks had been largely invisible. But these are potentially attractive targets for intervention, right? So for example, if you think about other factors that might lead to disparities in care quality for minority groups, one of the big things that's on the radar is structural racism, which includes all sorts of things like policies, but also institutional factors like implicit bias and so forth. And while those would be really important to change, they're very difficult to change as well. And so if we want to make more immediate change in the short term, things like changing the patterns of care and helping physicians become more interconnected might be more viable intervention target that could hopefully lead to better outcomes in the near term. There's also significant challenges, and this is where you get a little bit to the methodology component. Carolyn touched on some of this as well, but I see it exactly in my own research. So administrative data is really cool and lets us do a lot of new things, but it's not designed with research in mind. And so you have to work with what you've got, which isn't always great. So Medicare, for example, there's coding schemes only track a very limited set of racial categories, and they're also conflated with ethnicity. So they kind of group race and ethnicity into a single bucket, and you can't distinguish that in any way reliably. And so, if you're trying to make inferences about a particular population, you're kind of limited, and it's not always clear how these categories get assigned. The other thing I would say too is that the contexts that we want to explore are often really, really complicated. So healthcare is obviously a tremendously complex industry. And I'm trained, as I said, as a sociologist and spend a lot of time mostly looking at data. My primary firsthand experience with the healthcare system is as a patient. And so I might be looking at these data and have what I think is just, oh, this is an amazing insight. This looks like it'd be really useful. And then, but on the ground, the way that things work, it could be very different. And so what I found is really important in doing these sorts of projects is to work with people that are on the ground. And so a lot of the research that I do has practitioners, working physicians on the team. And I find that's really helpful, both because, the physicians are the data points. And so you want to enroll the people that are your subjects and get their point of view and make sure it's represented, but also to make sure that you're reliably understanding the data, and that any conclusions you would make and that would hopefully one day make their way out into the world are actually valid conclusions and reflect the nature of the setting reasonably. So that's it. I will stop there. And again, thanks so much for giving me the chance to share some of my work, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Russell. Now we've got some time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, the easiest way for me to see that is by going to the reactions button at the bottom of Zoom and then using your raise hand function. I already see a question from Enid. Please go ahead.
Hi. If you can't hear me well, let me know. So my question is for Carolyn. Thank you. So the thing I was interested in, since I look at American Indians and race, is how the data that's collected from the census, like what the tribes potentially would use them for in terms of, in terms of like relating to the federal government, as compared to the enrollment, their enrollment membership lists, which are different, right? Because that's totally different way of counting a population, like who's an enrolled member of a tribe versus who's claiming like ancestry or ethnicity related to that tribe in some way. And so I was wondering if you have any insight about like what the uses of that data is, or how these two different kinds of lists overlap or don't overlap. I know that's kind of a vague question, but.
Yeah, I can give it a shot. So tribes do define their own enrollment, and they have enrollment offices, and often those enrollment offices are understaffed, have poor computing systems, and don't actually have very much data about their people. So the people belong to the tribe, but the tribe doesn't know that much about the people. So that's one thing. Sometimes a tribe will open a casino, get a lot of money and fund that, and then know more about themselves. So the census is a source of information, a lot, but the data that tribes usually use from the Census Bureau is not based on the write-in response of I'm an American Indian, this is my tribe. That's not the data that they're using. They're using the data about who lives on the land that the tribe controls. And the Census Bureau works with tribes and states and cities to make geographic spaces that are sensible for the people that are in the space. So sometimes, like the city of St. Paul will send out a list of our little neighborhoods. So I live in the Lexham neighborhood, and they'll try to make the shape of the released data fit my neighborhood. And so the tribes send in their boundaries, and the data comes in from that. So what they're using it for is, certainly like housing funds, but also demographic projections for a water rights lawsuit, for example.
But the information on who lives in the boundaries doesn't it doesn't matter what their racial classification is, or obviously their enrollment.
Well, they can find out, I mean, within the boundary, then you know the race and ethnicity of the people within the boundary. And a lot of them will be American Indian. Most of those will report a tribe. But the fact, like, there's 500,000 Navajo around the nation, around the United States, but the Navajo tribe, that nation, wants to know about the Navajo people who live on the reservation. They also care about Navajo people who live outside the reservation, but mostly in terms of like how many people might possibly move back, but not like details about them, so they can have kind of a vague idea.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. I see Ann Meyer has a question. Please go ahead, Ann.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Sam, for organizing this. It was really interesting. All of you mentioned some of the values that are at play here. And I'm just wondering, and a few of you mentioned how they can conflict with one another. And so I'm wondering how the valuing of values is adjudicated in those cases. So for example, in another sociologist here, so we're dominating, but a logarithmic kind of bias, for example, in pre-trial detention for people who are accused of crimes. They decide whether or not that they will be detained based on an algorithm that is predictive of whether they might reoffend. But of course, those if you're detained, then you don't do as well in sentencing, if you're or even acquittal. And so there's some kind of biases baked into the efficiency, and so then the efficiency as a value competes with like maybe dignity or something like that. So how does that get meted out when those values conflict? Or how should it?
Either panelist, please go ahead.
I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I don't really have a great answer for it. I mean, it's interesting that one of the things, I mean, so one of the traditional ways to do that a little bit is with the IRB review of studies. But one of the interesting things that I've learned in doing more research in this area is that since so much of this administrative data is already pre-collected, and so you're not interacting with human subjects at all, a lot of it is just exempt research. And so even if you submit the IRB application, they're not really going to give you a super detailed review. They'll just say the study is exempt and so forth. And so, so it kind of raises some questions about whether maybe there should be different policy changes or things like that. I mean, the other thing too is, I mean, so I think I don't have a good solution. I mean, and I don't think this is the way to do it, but it goes back, for me personally, a lot of it goes back to what I mentioned with collaboration, so I tend to work in these big teams, and we talk a lot about what we're going to do, and we talk a lot about the directions of the research, and these conversations about trade-offs come up. And so, I always try to think it's good to just work with other people, and you've got at least some kind of check then against your own intuitions, because you might think like, oh, this is fine, it's not going to hurt anyone, or, oh, this data is probably okay to move to this computer or share with this person. And then, when you run it by someone else, you realize things you hadn't thought of or considered, or even the way you're framing certain things in the paper. So I think collaboration is one really good way, but that's not probably the huge scalable solution for the long term either. So I think it's a really good, important question.
Yeah, maybe one thing I can add, which is an idea that I've seen a bit, is if one has a policy tool that one is using, one can collect further survey data from the populations who will be most affected by the tool to ask them how they would prefer balancing these different values, and then using that as an input into the decision-making procedure. It's not a fail-safe thing. Aside from data collection issues, there's issues about how to balance different subgroups who may be affected, who have different ideas about what the balances of value should be. But that's a way that it's at least sensitive to the communities that are most affected by these tools. Carolyn, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, in the context that I talked about, the Census Bureau just wants to win. Like they collected the data and they want to make sure they're not going to be subjected to lawsuits or so they're just whatever kind of data privacy and efficiency they need to do is what they'll do. But I think it's as far as other issues come up for researchers trying to balance the different values. And in that case, I think having collaborations with a variety of people. So me collaborating with another white university professor isn't going to do it, you know?
Great. Wonderful. I'm afraid that we're out of time for our roundtable, but maybe I wanted to add one last note on this last point of collaboration that's come up again that Russell nicely raised in his presentation, which is that data science as an interdisciplinary activity tends to involve collaborations between people from different disciplines. People who do that don't always think necessarily of people from the humanities as people who might be good to include on collaborations. But I think these sorts of questions that we're raising might suggest that at least in certain contexts, having collaborations with people who are specialists in human values and how human decision-making procedures implicate them would be a good way to think about going forward. I'm hoping that that'll give you some food for thought as you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks everyone for coming and for spending an hour with us.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.